Hi guys, this is Limestuck, and today we will be looking at Henry VII's foreign policy. So first of all, I'll talk about an overview of Henry's aims. And in short, his three main aims were national security, recognition of the Tudor dynasty, and defence of any English trading interests. And when Henry VII became king, there were obviously other claimants to the throne, and his status as king was insecure. Therefore, he wanted to gain support from other monarchs, as opposition towards Henry VII may seek assistance from other countries, and support from other countries would strengthen his own position. So in order to build these positive relationships, Henry secured a series of truces with potential enemies. His initial aims as well were focused on the inheritance to the crown and his lack of money, yet later on in his reign, his foreign policy had a main focus on trade and the succession after himself. So the first place of significant interest was in Brittany and France, and relationships between England and France were initially friendly because Henry's fight for the throne had been strengthened by French support. However, problems in Brittany first started to cause problems, and this was in 1487. And France had taken advantage of a lack of a male heir in which Duke Francis II had. And Brittany was a fiefdom, which means an independently ruled area of the French crown. But France didn't want it to be independently ruled, and they wanted to take complete control. Now, this worried Henry because he believed that the coastline across the Channel should not be owned by one power, as it put the south coast of England in a weaker position. Also, Calais would be vulnerable, and this was the last place of England's medieval empire in France. Now, finally, Henry VII also had an obligation to aid Brittany due to the help that they gave him while he was a refugee in France before he came to the throne in England. But this all meant that France ended up invading Brittany in 1487 in what looked like they would take control, which takes me on to my first crisis of Henry VII's reign and one of the main points in his foreign policy, and that was the Breton crisis. And the Breton crisis was the only time in which Henry VII committed his troops outside of the British Isles. And at first, Henry VII gained extraordinary revenue from the Parliament of £100,000, and this was used to finance a small army. Now, at the same time, he opened negotiations with France and tried to win support for his interventions from other leading rulers of Europe. He managed to gain some support from people like Maximilian I, who was the Holy Roman Emperor-elect. Now, he gave support because he had contracted a proxy marriage, which means that one or both of the individuals are not present, with the Duchess of Anne, who was in control of Brittany, and he obviously didn't want Brittany to fall into French hands. Nevertheless, in 1491, she actually ended up marrying Charles VIII. But Henry the army crossed the Channel in April 1489, and Henry told the French that he was acting in support of Brittany and only as a defensive measure. However, France did not agree with this, and they ended up harbouring Perkin Warbeck and pouring yet more troops into Brittany. Now, the truth of England's intervention in Brittany was because of the Treaty of Redon, which they signed with the Duchess of Anne. And this meant that Anne would pay for a small English army to protect them. However, Henry did end up leading this army of 12,000 men in Brittany, and he judged correctly that the French did not want a long conflict because of their interest in the Italian peninsula. So this meant that the Treaty of Étampes was signed in 1492, where Henry's army would leave France with 745,000 crowns, and there was an agreement that France would not support Henry's enemies, and this included Perkin Warbeck, who we learnt about in the last lesson. So the Breton crisis was a success for Henry VII, as he managed to show his strong diplomatic skills, and England had a basic relationship with France, which never really caused any problems for the rest of his reign. However, it was expensive. He did have to gain extraordinary revenue, which did cause many problems, including rebellions, which we learnt about in the last video. So the next country of significant importance to Henry VII was Spain. And in a way to protect himself against France, a strong relationship between England and Spain was invaluable. Now, at the time, Spain was a loose federation between the Kingdom of Castile and the Kingdom of Aragon. You may know Aragon from Catherine of Aragon, who we'll learn about later and is extremely famous. But one of the most important developments was the Treaty of Medina del Campo, which took place in 1489. Now, this agreement stated that the two monarchies would offer support to each other in the case of an attack. Neither country would harbour rebels or pretenders to the throne. Neither country would make agreements with France without the consultation of the other country. And Arthur, who was the Prince of Wales and Henry VIII's brother, was to marry Catherine of Aragon, who I just talked about, and she was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, the problem with the treaty was the complications surrounding the marriage. And also the fact that Perkin Warbeck threatened England, and Ferdinand did not want to go ahead with it because of this unrest within England. In addition, the two monarchs were unable to agree on the size of Catherine of Aragon's dowry, which was the amount of property brought by a bride to their husband in marriage. However, the marriage did take place in 1501 until the death of Prince Arthur in 1502. Now, after the death, the relationship between England and Spain was significantly weakened. And although Henry initially suggested that Catherine of Aragon should marry Prince Henry, later known as Henry VIII, there was a severe lack of enthusiasm for the marriage, as it required a papal dispensation, which was exemption from the law. Now, Henry eventually lost enthusiasm when Isabella died, and Ferdinand eventually became less significant. So as Ferdinand and Isabella, who was dead at this point, as they started to lose importance, Henry actually started to support the Catherine of Aragon's sister, Joanna, and her husband, Philip of Burgundy. And they actually coincidentally arrived in England after a shipwreck in 1506, where they signed the Treaty of Windsor. And this secured English support for Joanna and Philip, as well as strengthening trade with the agreement in Intercursus Malus. Now, unfortunately, this was never enforced, however. Now, the Earl of Suffolk was also handed over to Henry VII, who was imprisoned straight away, and there was a proposed marriage between Henry VII and Philip's sister Margaret. However, this was not to be. This proposed marriage did actually worsen relationships with Ferdinand, who eventually turned to France and Louis VII instead. So when Philip of Burgundy died, it meant that Ferdinand once again became the King of Castile and again started to regain his importance. And he ensured that the marriage between Prince Henry and Catherine of Aragon would not take place in Henry VII's lifetime. So this result was Henry VII's diplomatic isolation. And instead of Spain, he turned to France and the Netherlands for an alliance. So Spain were no longer important to Henry VII. But by the end of the reign in 1508, the League of Cambrai was set up between Louis VII and Ferdinand. And essentially, England now had no direct enemies at the end of his reign, which in some ways were good. It did manage to create the security. However, England were not a big player on the European stage. So the next country to talk about is Scotland, which had been an enemy in the past and obviously shared a border. So this meant that their support could not be guaranteed. Now, they also had their own distinct country, which included a monarch and a parliament. So to exacerbate this situation, the Scots also looked towards France to preserve their independence, and France was one of England's most renowned enemies, as we've learned already. So in order to keep peace between the two countries, Henry VII arranged a 3-year truce with James III in 1486, so soon after he was crowned king. However, James III was assassinated and he left the throne to his 15-year-old son, James IV, in 1488. So the relationship was made worse when the two countries, when James IV harboured Perkin Warbeck in the country. Now here he received not only a pension, but a marriage to the king's cousin, Lady Catherine Gordon. So when James IV encouraged Perkin Warbeck to cross the border with an army in 1496, the English retaliated with an invasion of Scotland. Now the results of this were the Cornish Rebellion, which actually had positive consequences in terms of a relationship between Scotland and England. Now this is because both countries realised that a truce was required and they signed the Truce of Ayton in 1497. Now in 1502 it was transformed into a formal peace treaty, and this was called the Treaty of Perpetual Peace. Now hereby, Henry VII's daughter Margaret was betrothed to James IV, where they married in 1503. So the positive relationships after this event between the two countries were able to endure in Henry VII's reign. So another country in the British Isles which Henry had to think about was in Ireland. Now the only area of Henry VII's control in Ireland was the Pale, whereas the rest was controlled by Anglo-Norman barons. And the dominant figure in Ireland, who was the Earl of Kildare, who had been Lord Deputy since 1477. And he was feared by Henry VII because he had Yorkist sympathisers, and he had crowned Lambert Simnel, who was one of the pretenders, as the King of Ireland, and he offered support for Perkin Warbeck, another one of the pretenders. So to gain further control of the country, Henry VII appointed his son Henry as the Lieutenant of Ireland, with Poynings as his deputy. To establish his royal authority, Poynings used threat and bribery in 1495, and this was where the Poynings Law was passed. Now this meant that laws could only be passed in Ireland with the approval of the English crown. Nevertheless, this was too expensive, and in 1496 he had to recall Poynings and depend on the Earl of Kildare as deputy. Now this was made easier, however, by the fact that the Earl of Kildare had stopped supporting the Yorkists and was now loyal to Henry VII and no longer a threat. So by 1500, Henry was able to gain a decent amount of control over Ireland, another one of his successes in his foreign policy. So the final places to learn about are Burgundy, the Netherlands and the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire was a loose federation of around 300 states where the emperor was to be elected. Now this emperor was always to be a member of the Austrian Habsburg dynasty. So the majority of English trade went through the Netherlands in places such as Antwerp and Bruges. And this meant that the good relationships were essential. So the main problems in the area, however, did come when Margaret came in control of her late husband's estate. And she was the sister of Edward IV, but more importantly, Richard III. Now this meant that she was the leading Yorkist. So she and Maximilian I offered hospitality to Perkin Warbeck, and this ultimately meant that the relationships between the countries deteriorated. Now, as a result, Henry had to choose between trade and securing the dynasty, two conflicting aims. So this meant that Henry ended up sacrificing trade in London until Perkin Warbeck was released. Now, eventually, both Henry VII and Philip were able to improve the trade again, and they agreed on the Intercursus Magnus in 1496. Now, Intercursus Magnus set out that English merchants could export to any part of the Duke of Burgundy's land apart from Flanders, a big development in trade and a success. So finally, I have to talk about how successful was Henry's foreign policy. And in general, he did succeed because he managed to secure English trade, keep security, and secure the dynasty, which were his three main aims at the start. Now, although his original plan was not carried out to perfection, his pragmatic approach meant that positive relationships were able to endure. However, his limited financial budget did mean that he was not able to have any aspirations of expanding territory, and it was solely about protection and just keeping Britain afloat. So thank you for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Bye.